The room was already full before the afternoon truly began. Chairs were placed close together, some mismatched, some borrowed from nearby rooms. People stood along the walls, holding cups of tea that had gone cold without anyone noticing. It was meant to be a simple gathering, nothing grand or carefully planned, just a quiet community event where families came together, talked softly, and passed time in each other's company. Near the back of the room, almost hidden by shadows, sat an old upright piano. Its wood was scratched and faded, the kind of wear that only time could create. A thin layer of dust rested on its top, untouched for months, maybe years. It did not stand out. In fact, most people did not even look at it. To them, it was just another forgotten object, pushed aside like an old chair no one wanted to throw away. The room slowly filled with sound. Laughter rose and fell. Quiet conversations overlapped. Someone coughed. Someone else adjusted their seat. Children shifted restlessly, bored and impatient. It felt like any other gathering where people came more out of habit than excitement. In the middle of it all sat the grandmother. She was small. Her body bent slightly forward as if time itself had gently pressed down on her shoulders. Her hair was thin and silver, neatly combed back. Her hands rested in her lap, folded calmly, veins visible beneath pale skin. She wore a simple sweater and dark shoes that looked older than some of the people in the room. At 96 years old, she did not draw attention. People greeted her kindly, but briefly. Some smiled at her as they passed, others nodded politely. A few spoke louder than necessary, assuming she could not hear well. Most simply overlooked her, not out of cruelty, but because age often makes people invisible. She did not seem to mind. Her eyes moved quietly around the room, observing everything without urgency. She watched the way people leaned toward one another when they spoke. She noticed the children tapping their feet. She glanced once, just once, toward the piano in the corner. No one noticed that look. As time passed, someone near the front stood up to speak. It was nothing formal, just a short announcement meant to fill the silence. They thanked everyone for coming and mentioned how nice it was to see familiar faces. The words were polite and ordinary, the kind that drift through the air without leaving a mark. When the speaker finished, there was an awkward pause. No one was quite sure what to do next. Someone joked that it might be nice to have a little music. A few people laughed lightly. Another person glanced around and said, half serious, half playful, that there was a piano right there. The comment was meant as a joke. People looked toward the piano for a moment, then away again. It looked old, forgotten. No one imagined it would be used. Someone shrugged and said they didn't know how to play. Another person laughed and said they hadn't touched a piano since childhood. The idea faded quickly, like many small ideas do. Then the grandmother moved. At first it was so subtle that no one noticed. She adjusted her hands on her lap. Then she placed them on the arms of her chair. Slowly, carefully, she leaned forward. The chair made a soft sound as she pushed herself up. A few people turned their heads, curious. Someone close by instinctively reached out, ready to help her stand. She smiled gently and shook her head, letting them know she was fine. She stood there for a moment, steadying herself. The room continued to buzz with quiet talk, but the sound had lowered slightly. There was something about her movement that drew attention. Even if no one understood why, she took one slow step forward, then another. Her steps were careful, measured as if she was counting them in her mind. She moved with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that rushing only led to mistakes. People watched now, unsure what she was doing. Some assumed she was heading toward the exit. Others thought she might need something. No one guessed the truth. She walked past rows of chairs, past people who shifted to give her space. Her eyes were focused ahead, calm and steady. There was no hesitation in her expression, no confusion. When she reached the piano, she stopped. A quiet ripple passed through the room. Someone whispered, asking if she needed help. Another person frowned slightly, confused. A few smiled politely, thinking perhaps she just wanted to look at it. She reached out and touched the edge of the piano. Her fingers rested there for a moment, as if greeting an old friend. The touch was gentle, almost respectful. She traced the wood lightly, feeling its surface beneath her skin. The room grew quieter, though no one had asked for silence. She pulled the bench out slowly and turned it just enough to sit. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. When she lowered herself onto the bench, there was a soft creak, but it held. A few people exchanged glances. Was she really going to play? The idea seemed almost impossible. At her age, most people struggled with everyday tasks. The thought of her playing a piano felt unrealistic, almost absurd. Some expected her to laugh and say she was joking. She did not. She adjusted her position slightly, sitting upright. Her back straightened more than anyone expected. Her shoulders relaxed. She lifted her hands. They hovered above the keys. The room held its breath. Some people leaned forward without realizing it. Others stopped fidgeting. Even the children grew still, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Her fingers trembled just a little. Age had left its mark there, no doubt about it. The skin was thin, the joints enlarged. These were not the hands people expected to see poised above a piano. She closed her eyes for a moment. Nothing happened. That moment stretched longer than anyone expected. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone wondered if she had forgotten what she was about to do. Then she breathed in slowly and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, but clear. It was not the sound of a random note or a mistake. It was intentional, controlled. A second note followed, then another. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned fully toward the piano. A silence spread across the room, not forced, but natural. As if the music itself had asked for it, the grandmother's fingers moved carefully, confidently. There was no rush. Each note landed exactly where it was meant to. People stared, stunned. No one spoke. The piano that had been ignored for so long now filled the room with sound. The music was gentle, almost fragile, but it carried weight. It felt personal, like a story told without words. The grandmother's face remained calm, her eyes still closed. In that moment, she did not look like someone nearing the end of a long life. She looked present, focused, alive. The room, once full of noise and distraction, had fallen completely silent, and everyone knew they were about to witness something they would never forget. As the music continued, something unseen began to unfold, something far deeper than the notes filling the room. While the audience sat still, listening, the grandmother's mind traveled backward through time. Two places no one else in the room could see. Long before her hair turned silver and her hands grew thin. She had been a young girl in a small home where sound mattered. Back then, silence did not mean peace. Silence often meant worry. It meant waiting. It meant holding your breath and hoping the day would pass without. Bad news. Music was different. Music was safety. She had discovered that early, when she was barely tall enough to reach the keys. The piano in her childhood home was not fancy. Some keys stuck. Others were chipped. But to her it was magical. When she pressed the keys, the world made sense. The noise of life softened, and her thoughts lined up neatly, one after another. She practiced whenever she could. Early in the mornings, before the house woke up. Late at night, when everyone else slept, she learned to play by watching, listening, and repeating. No one pushed her. No one forced her. She played because something inside her needed it, but life had other plans. As she grew older, responsibilities arrived quietly, then all at once. There were bills to worry about, work to be done, people who depended on her. Music slowly moved from the center of her life to the edges. Not because she stopped loving it, but because survival came first. Then came harder times. The world changed. Days grew uncertain. Fear became familiar. The piano stayed where it was, but her hands touched it less and less. Weeks passed. Then months. Then years. She told herself she would return to it someday. Someday came and went. Marriage followed. Then children. Then long days filled with work that left her tired in ways sleep could not fix. The piano became a memory. something she thought about only when she heard music drifting from a radio or passing through an open window. She never spoke much about it. People assumed she had never played. It was easier that way. Music lived quietly inside her, untouched, but never gone. Even as her body aged, the memory of the keys never faded. She remembered the weight of each note, the way certain chords felt warm while others felt heavy. She remembered how music could hold sadness without breaking under it, and now, decades later, sitting in that room, her fingers remembered too. Each note she played was not just sound. It was a memory rising gently to the surface. A moment from long ago. A feeling she thought time had erased. The audience could sense it, though they knew nothing of her past. They felt the depth in her playing. This was not the music of practice or performance. It was the music of a life lived fully, with joy and loss woven together. Some listeners felt a tightness in their chest and did not know why. Others felt their eyes sting without warning. The room remained silent, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was full. Her hands moved steadily now, more confident than before. The slight tremble faded as memory guided her fingers. Muscle memory, buried deep, had awakened. The piano responded, though old and worn. It carried the sound faithfully. Each note echoed softly against the walls, wrapping around the people sitting there. It felt intimate, like the music was meant only for them. A woman near the front pressed her lips together, holding back tears. A man in the back lowered his head, staring at the floor, lost in his own thoughts. Even the children seemed quieter than ever, sensing the seriousness of the moment. No one checked their phone, no one whispered. The grandmother opened her eyes briefly and looked down at the keys. There was no fear in her expression. Only focus. Only calm. She adjusted her hands slightly and continued. With each passing note, her posture changed. Her back straightened a little more. Her breathing became deeper, steadier. It was as if the music was giving something back to her, turning energy she thought she had lost. Time felt strange in that room. Minutes passed, but no one noticed. The outside world faded away. There were no clocks ticking loudly, no reminders of what came next. There was only the sound of the piano and the quiet understanding shared by everyone listening. For the grandmother, felt like coming home. She remembered why she had loved the piano so deeply, why it had once been her escape, why it had stayed with her all these years. Even when untouched, she had not lost it. She had only carried it. As the music flowed, small imperfections appeared. A note slightly softer than intended. A pause, just a moment longer than expected. But these did not weaken the performance. They made it real. They made it human. The audience did not want perfection. They wanted truth. And that was exactly what she was giving them. Her hands slowed for a moment, lingering on a gentle phrase. The sound softened, almost like a whisper. Some listeners leaned in, afraid to miss even a single note. The grandmother's face softened into something, close to a smile. Not because she was performing, but because she was remembering. The room remained still, completely unaware that they were listening to a lifetime unfold, one key at a time. And the music continued, carrying her story forward. Deeper into the hearts of everyone present, the music did not stop. It flowed gently, one note leading into the next, as if it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. The grandmother no longer hesitated. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, guided by something deeper than thought. The people in the room were fully drawn in now. No one shifted in their seat. No one cleared their throat. Even breathing felt louder than it should have been. It was as if the entire room had agreed, without speaking. To protect the sound filling the air, a man standing near the wall slowly crossed his arms. Not out of discomfort, but because the music had reached somewhere inside him he did not expect. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes and then stopped, afraid that even that small movement might break the moment. The grandmother's hands moved across the keys with care, but also with purpose. This was not a performance meant to impress. There were no fast, flashy movements. No dramatic pauses meant to draw attention. The beauty came from honesty. Each note carried weight. Some sounded warm and hopeful. Others felt heavy, like memories that had never fully healed. Together, they told a story that did not need words. The piano itself seemed to awaken. Its old frame vibrated softly, filling the room with sound that felt larger than the instrument should have allowed. The notes traveled into every corner, brushing against the walls, settling into the quiet spaces between people. For a moment, the grandmother opened her eyes and looked at the keys. She adjusted her hands slightly, as if responding to the piano's voice. Then she closed her eyes again. She was not in the room anymore. In her mind, she was young again, sitting at a piano that smelled of old wood and dust. She could hear the sounds of her childhood home around her, the creak of the floor, the faint noise from outside. All of it blended into the music. But this time, there was no rush. No one was waiting for her to stop. No one was asking her to be practical. She allowed the music to take its time. The audience felt that patience. It slowed them down, pulled them out of their usual thoughts. Worries about tomorrow faded. Reminders of the past softened. For a few rare minutes, everyone was exactly where they needed to be. A child near the back leaned against a chair, eyes wide, watching her hands move. The child did not understand the history behind the music, but felt its emotion clearly. It was enough. The grandmother's shoulders relaxed further. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the song. Each breath came easier than the last. It was as if the piano was carrying some of the weight she had been holding for years. There were moments when the music grew quieter, almost fragile. The notes barely touched the air before fading away. Then, gently, the sound would grow again, stronger, fuller, as if reminding everyone that even after silence, something always follows. The room seemed to shrink, not in size, but in distance. People felt closer to one another, connected by the shared experience. Strangers exchanged brief glances filled with understanding. No one needed to explain how they felt. The grandmother's fingers paused for just a second longer than before. A small pause, it felt. Intentional in that pause. The room held its breath. Then she continued, pressing the keys with renewed calm. The melody shifted slightly, taking on a softer tone. It felt reflective, almost like a goodbye, though no one knew why. The music stirred memories in the listeners. Some thought of people they had lost. Others thought of moments they wished they could return to. The music did not force these thoughts. It simply made space for them. Tears fell quietly. No one was embarrassed. The grandmother's face remained peaceful. There was no sign of strain or effort. Despite her age, despite the years between her and the piano, she looked completely at ease. Her hands slowed again. The notes stretched out, lingering just a little longer. The sounds softened, becoming more gentle with each passing moment. The end was approaching. Some in the room sensed it and felt a quiet sadness. They did not want the music to stop. They did not want to return to ordinary time. The grandmother pressed the final notes carefully, letting them ring out fully. She did not rush the ending. She allowed the sound to fade naturally, honoring every last vibration. When the final note disappeared, silence filled the room once more. But this silence was different. It was full. No one moved. No one spoke. The grandmother kept her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her eyes remained closed. It was as if she needed one more moment to return from wherever the music had taken her. The room stayed still, afraid to disturb her. Then she slowly lifted her hands, placed them in her lap. She opened her eyes. The room exhaled. For a brief second, nothing happened. No applause, no words, just shared stillness. Then someone near the back stood up. Another followed soon. The room filled with quiet movement as people rose to their feet one by one. The applause began softly, then grew stronger, warmer, more heartfelt. The grandmother looked surprised. She turned slightly, looking out at the faces in front of her. Some were smiling. Some were crying. All were looking at her with something close to awe. She gave a small, shy smile. Not the smile of someone seeking praise, but the smile of someone who had simply shared a piece of herself. The piano stood silent again, but it no longer felt. Forgotten. Neither did she. The room had been changed, and everyone knew it. The applause slowly softened. Not because people wanted to stop, but because they did not know how to move forward from what had just happened. The sound lingered in the air like the last echo of the piano. Gentle and full. The grandmother remained seated for a moment longer. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She looked at the floor, then at the piano, as if saying a private thank you. Only then did she turn toward the room. Her smile was small and unsure. She was not used to this kind of tension. People began to speak, but their voices were softer than before, as if the music had taught them a new way to sound. Someone near the front said how beautiful it was. Another person thanked her. A few more words followed, overlapping gently. She nodded and smiled, listening carefully. A chair scraped lightly against the floor as someone stepped closer. Then another person joined. Soon, a small group gathered around her, forming a respectful distance. Not wanting to overwhelm her, one person asked how long she had been playing. She paused. "Thinking a long time ago," she said quietly. Her voice was steady but soft, like the music she had just played. There was no pride in it, no sadness either, just truth. Someone else asked when she had last played before today. She looked at the keys again. "I don't remember." "It's been many years." The answer surprised them. People exchanged glances, trying to understand how something so beautiful could come from hands that had been away from the piano for so long. But the grandmother did not explain further. She did not feel the need to. The room felt different now. The walls were the same. The chairs had not moved much, but the air itself felt warmer, heavier with feeling. Conversations resumed slowly, but they were no longer shallow or rushed. Strangers spoke to one another like old friends, Man who had been quiet the entire time wiped his face and laughed softly at himself. A woman hugged someone beside her without saying a word. Even the children seemed calmer, their voices lower, their movements slower. The piano stood quietly in the corner again, but it no longer felt invisible. It felt respected. The grandmother was helped back to her chair, though she could have walked on her own. She allowed the help this time, her energy gently fading now that the moment had passed. As she sat, someone brought her a glass of water. She thanked them with a nod. People continued to come up. One by one. Some simply said thank you. Others shared how the music made them feel. One person said it reminded them of someone they missed. Another said it brought peace they had not felt in a long time. The grandmother listened to every word. She did not rush anyone. She did not brush off their feelings. When she spoke, it was with care. "I'm glad," she said more than once. "That makes me glad." For her, the music had never been about being seen. It had always been about being felt. A quiet moment passed where she sat alone watching the room. She noticed the way people moved now, slower and more thoughtful. She noticed how some glanced at the piano as they spoke, as if it had become part of the conversation. She rested her hands on her knees. They felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes after doing something honest. Someone nearby asked if she would play again. She smiled, amused by the question. "Maybe another day," she said. There was no promise in it. No refusal either, just possibility. The gathering continued, but nothing felt the same as before. People stayed longer than they planned. No one seemed eager to leave. The grandmother watched them with quiet interest. She felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not pride, not excitement, but connection. For years, I had lived gently in the background, content but unnoticed. She had learned to accept that time slowly pulls people away from the center of things. But in that moment, she felt seen, not for her age, not for her fragility, but for who she was. She thought about the long path that led her here. All the moments when music had waited patiently inside her. All the years when she believed that part of her life was finished. She realized something important. It had never left. It had simply been quiet as the event began to wind down. People gathered their coats and bags. Goodbyes were longer than usual. Smiles lingered. Several people stopped to look at the piano before leaving. One person gently lifted the lid, as if checking that it was real. Another ran their fingers lightly over the keys, careful not to make a sound. The grandmother watched this with a soft smile. When it was time for her to leave, someone offered an arm. She accepted. Standing slowly, she took one last look at the room. It looked ordinary again, but she knew better. She knew what had happened there as she walked toward the door. She heard someone behind her say they would never forget that moment. She paused and turned slightly. "Neither will I," she said. Outside, the air was cool and calm. The sounds of the world returned, distant and steady. Life continued, just as it always did. But something had shifted, not just for her, for everyone who had been in that room. They carried the music with them, even after it was gone. And she carried something too, a quiet reminder that it is never too late for a forgotten part of yourself to be heard. The days that followed passed quietly, but the memory of that afternoon stayed alive. People who had been in the room found themselves thinking about it at unexpected moments. While washing dishes, while driving home, while lying awake at night, the sound of the piano returned to them, soft and clear, as if it had settled somewhere deep inside. For the grandmother, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Mornings were slow. Afternoons were calm. She sat by the window often, watching the light change as the day moved forward. Nothing around her looked different, yet something within her had shifted. She felt lighter, not in her body, but in her heart. She found herself humming sometimes, very softly, tunes she had not thought about in years. The music no longer felt locked away. It felt close, ready, patient. One afternoon, she paused near the piano in her home. It had been there for years, mostly silent, used as a place to set books or small items. She stood there for a long moment, resting her hand on the edge. She did not sit, not yet, but she smiled. That was enough. Word of what happened spread gently. No headlines, no big announcements, just people telling people. Someone shared the story with a friend. That friend shared it with someone else. The story traveled not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. People talked about how quiet the room became, about how unexpected the moment was, about how it made them feel. Some said it reminded them to slow down. Others said it reminded them of dreams they had left behind. The grandmother never heard most of these conversations, and she did not need to. She had already received what mattered: respect, connection, and the quiet joy of being understood without having to explain herself. When she thought back on that day, she did not focus on the applause. She remembered the silence before the first note, the way the room leaned into stillness, the way the piano responded to her touch, as if it had been waiting. She remembered how her hands stopped, shaking, how her breath deepened, how time seemed to soften around her. She understood now that music had never asked her for perfection. It had only asked her to return, and she had. On another afternoon, weeks later, she sat down at the piano again, just for herself. No audience, no expectations. She pressed a few keys, slowly, gently. The sound filled the room. She laughed quietly, surprised by how natural it felt. Her hands remembered. She played only a little that day, enough to feel complete, enough to feel whole. Elsewhere, people who had been in that room carried the memory forward in their own ways. One person signed up for a music class they had been putting off for years. Another picked up an old hobby. Someone else simply called a loved one they had not spoken to in a long time. The moment had planted seeds, not loudly, but deeply. The grandmother did not know about any of this, but she would have smiled if she did. She continued her days with the same quiet grace she always had. But now, when people looked at her, they saw something different. They saw possibility. They saw proof that time does not erase what truly matters. They saw that passion does not age. At another small gathering, Someone asked if she would play again someday. She thought for a moment. Maybe, she said, her eyes warm. If the piano asks nicely? People laughed softly, but they understood. The story did not end with a stage or a spotlight. It ended in small, meaningful moments. In quiet afternoons, in gentle music played for no one but the soul. The room where it all happened returned to its normal use. Chairs were rearranged. The piano was dusted more often now. Someone made sure it stayed in tune. It was no longer forgotten. Neither was she years from now. People would still talk about that afternoon. Not as a performance, not as a surprise, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments come from the people we least expect, that it is never too late to be heard, and that when someone shares a true part of themselves, the world, even for a moment, knows how to listen. Time continued its steady movement, as it always did, but the moment in that room refused to fade. It settled into memory in a quiet way, returning when least expected, not as a loud reminder, but as a gentle presence for the grandmother. The days felt fuller, though nothing around her had changed much. She still woke early, still moved carefully through her mornings, still rested when her body asked her to. But something new had taken root inside her. She trusted herself again, not in a bold or dramatic way, just enough to listen when something inside her whispered. On some afternoons, she sat near the piano and let her fingers rest on the closed lid. She did not always open it. Sometimes the touch alone was enough. It reminded her that the music was not gone, that it had simply been waiting for her permission. Other days, she played only a little. She chose simple melodies, familiar ones. She played slowly, allowing each note to breathe. There was no rush, no pressure. The music belonged to her now, not to an audience, not to expectations. She noticed how her hands felt, steadier each time, how her breathing matched the rhythm, how the room seemed to soften around her. The piano became part of her routine again, not as a task, but as a companion. Elsewhere, the story continued to move through people's lives. Someone who had been in the room that day brought their own child to see the old piano during a quiet afternoon. They spoke softly about what had happened there, about the silence, about the feeling that followed the final note. The child listened closely, eyes wide, imagining the scene. Another person shared the story with an elderly neighbor, who sat quietly afterward and said it had been a long time since anyone asked about the things they once loved. Small conversations grew from it, honest ones. People began asking different questions. What did you love doing when you were younger? What did you stop doing, and why? What part of you have you been keeping quiet? The answers were not always easy. Sometimes they came with sadness, sometimes with laughter, often with surprise. The grandmother never knew how many of these moments she had inspired, but she felt the change when people looked at her. They did not see only her age. They saw her story. When she walked into a room now, people greeted her differently. Not louder, not slower, just more present. They listened when she spoke. They waited. She appreciated that, not because she wanted attention, but because it felt like respect. One afternoon, a visitor asked her what made her decide to sit at the piano that day. She thought carefully before answering. "I didn't decide," she said. "I just listened." The visitor nodded, understanding more than the words alone could explain. The grandmother reflected often on how close she had come to letting that moment pass. How easily she could have stayed in her chair. How simple it would have been to tell herself it was too late. She realized how many moments in life are like that. Quiet chances, waiting patiently, as weeks turned into months. The piano in the community room was used more often. Someone practiced in the evenings. Someone else played softly during quiet hours. It became a place people approached with care, not because of rules, but because of meaning. The grandmother visited the room again one afternoon. Walking slowly, supported by an arm offered with kindness. She did not play that day. She simply sat and listened while someone else pressed the keys. She smiled. The music sounded different in another person's hands. But the feeling was the same. Alive, she realized then that the moment had never belonged only to her. It belonged to everyone who had been willing to stop and listen. At home, she kept a small notebook nearby. Sometimes she wrote down thoughts, short ones, simple ones, lines about memories, lines about sounds, lines about how the light fell across the keys. In the afternoon, she did not plan to share them. They were just for her, but they mattered. Her world felt wider now, even as her body grew more tired. She understood something she had not understood. She was younger. Life does not always get louder as it becomes meaningful. Sometimes it gets quieter, and in that quiet, truth has space to speak. On a calm evening, she played again. The window was open. The air was cool. The sound of the piano drifted softly outside, noticed by most. That was fine. The music did not need witnesses to exist. She stopped after a few minutes. She felt complete. She thought about the room that had fallen silent, about the faces, about the shared breath, about the understanding that had passed between strangers without words. She hoped they remembered it, but more than that, she hoped they remembered themselves. The days continued, as days always do, ordinary, gentle, real, and yet something extraordinary remained. A reminder that no matter how much time passes, what truly belongs to us does not disappear. It waits quietly, patiently, for the moment. We are ready to listen again. The memory of that afternoon did not fade the way most moments do. It stayed, returning gently, like a familiar tune that comes back without being called. People who had been there carried it quietly, each in their own way. For the grandmother, life remained simple. She did not suddenly become someone different. She still preferred quiet mornings. She still moved slowly and rested often. But something inside her had settled into peace. She no longer felt like a part of her life had been left unfinished. Some days, she sat near the window and watched the world move. Cars passed. Birds landed and flew away. Children's voices drifted in from far away. The world felt busy, but she did not feel rushed by it. She felt present. The piano at home became less of a forgotten object and more of a gentle invitation. She did not force herself to play. She did not set goals. When she felt like it, she sat down. When she didn't, she simply rested her hand on the top and smiled. Music no longer felt like something she had lost. It felt like something that had grown quietly, alongside her life. People around her noticed the change. They could not name it exactly, but they felt it. She seemed calmer, more settled. Her words came with ease, and her silences felt comfortable, not empty. Occasionally, someone would ask about the piano. She never told the story in a dramatic way. She spoke simply. About sitting down, about playing a few notes, about how the room went quiet. That's all, she would say. But those listening understood there was more at the community room. The piano was treated differently now. It was cleaned often. Someone placed a small lamp beside it. Another person kept a cloth nearby to wipe the keys after use. People played it with care, not because they were afraid of making mistakes, but because they understood it held something meaningful. One evening, someone played a soft melody while only a few chairs were filled. The grandmother was not there that night, but her presence was felt. The silence between notes felt familiar. The room listened again. Elsewhere, the story continued to move quietly. It reached people who were tired. People who thought they were too old to start again. People who believed certain doors were already closed. It did not push them. It simply reminded them. The grandmother thought often about how easily that moment could have passed without notice. How she might have stayed seated. How fear or doubt could have kept her still. She understood. Now that courage does not always look bold. Sometimes it looks like standing up. Slowly. Sometimes it looks like placing your hands on the keys. Sometimes it looks like trusting yourself after a long silence. One afternoon, She was asked what advice she would give to someone, felt it was too late to begin again. She thought for a long moment. "Listen closely," she said. "If something keeps calling you, it's not done with you yet." That was all. The days passed gently. Seasons shifted. The light changed. The grandmother continued on, steady and calm. She played the piano sometimes, not to remember the past, but to enjoy the present. And when she didn't play, the music still lived within her. The room that once fell silent returned to normal use, but it never lost what it had gained. People entered it differently now. With more awareness, with more patience, they remembered how silence could feel full and how one quiet moment could leave a lasting echo. The story did not need to grow louder. It had already done its work. It lived on in small changes, gentle choices, and quiet courage, and in the simple truth that it is never too late to listen to the part of yourself that has been waiting to be heard. Life continued to unfold in quiet ways, just as it always had. The grandmother did not measure her days by big events anymore. She measured them by small comforts: warm light through the window, a familiar chair, the gentle sound of keys when she chose to play. What surprised her most was not the music itself, but how it changed the way she noticed the world. She listened more closely. Now, two people, two silence to herself. When someone spoke to her, she did not rush to answer. She let their words settle. She had learned through music that meaning often lives in the space between sounds. People seemed drawn to that calm. They lingered longer when they visited. They spoke more honestly. Sometimes they shared things they had not planned to say. She listened. She always listened. One afternoon, someone asked her if she ever felt regret about the years she spent away from the piano. She thought carefully before responding. "No," she said at last. "Those years taught me other songs." The person smiled, unsure what she meant, but feeling the truth in her words. She understood now that her life had never been empty of music. It had simply changed forms. It had been there in voices, in footsteps, in long days and quiet nights. The piano was only one way of listening, as more time passed. The story of that afternoon continued to ripple outward. It was shared gently, never exaggerated. People told it as they remembered it. With honesty and care, they spoke about the silence, about how no one wanted to interrupt it, about how it felt like time itself had paused to listen. Those who heard the story often sat quietly afterward, thinking about their own lives, about what they had put aside, about what they still carried. The grandmother did not know how far the story traveled. She did not try to follow it. She believed moments were meant to go where they were needed. Her focus stayed close, on the present, on the sound of her own breath, on the gentle weight of her hands. Some days, she did not play the piano at all. She did not feel guilty about it. She knew now that choosing rest was also a kind of listening. Other days, she played just one simple tune. She stopped when it felt right. That was enough. One quiet morning, she sat by the window and watched the sky slowly change color. She thought about how many times she had watched dawn and dusk over the years without truly seeing them. Now, she noticed everything: the way light softened edges, the way shadows moved, the way time felt less heavy when she did not fight it. She realized that the moment in the community room had not been about the piano at all. It had been about permission. Permission to take up space, permission to speak without words, permission to be exactly who she was. She hoped others had felt that. Too, at another gathering, much smaller than the first, someone asked her to share a few words. She was surprised, but not uncomfortable. She stood slowly and looked around the room. "I didn't plan that day," she said. "I just trusted a feeling." "I think we forget sometimes that feelings are trying to help us." No one interrupted her. They listened the same way they had listened to the piano. She sat down again, her message complete. As the years continued, her steps grew slower, her hands more delicate, but her spirit remained steady. She did not fear aging the way she once had. She understood now that growing older did not mean growing quieter inside. It meant learning which sounds truly mattered. One evening, she played the piano while the room was dark, except for a small lamp. The notes floated softly, barely touching the walls. She felt peaceful when she finished. She rested her hands and closed her eyes. She thought of the room that fell silent, of the faces, of the shared stillness. She smiled. That moment had given her something rare. Not attention, but understanding. And that understanding continued to shape her days. The story did not end in a dramatic way. It continued quietly, in the way people listened more carefully. In the way silence felt less empty, in the way one woman, at 96, reminded everyone that it is never too late to let your true voice be heard. The piano waited patiently whenever she approached it, and she knew, now more than ever, that she was never too late to answer.